This is a true story from my life, one that still makes my hands shake when I think about it. The first thing I remember was the cold bite of steel against my skin, the clang of the vault door sealing shut, and the echo of my family laughter fading into silence. I was staring at the inside of a locked metal chamber, their betrayal hanging in the air, heavier than the dust on the concrete floor. My own blood-me nephews. My brother's children had trapped me like I was nothing more than an old relic to be discarded, and all I had in that vault with me was a single broken chair, a flickering light bulb overhead, and the burning knowledge that the people I loved most wanted me gone. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel, tell us where you're from, and what time it is, right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. I should back up. My name's Richard, though. Folks just called me Rick. All my life, I was born in Charleston, South Carolina, back in 1954. Grew up around salt air, thick marshes, and family that always had their noses deep in tradition. My father built a fortune in construction and real estate, and that money trickled down through us like a slow river, steady, wide, and powerful. It bought us land houses, and yes, even the old bank building downtown that my brother later converted into what he called the family vault. At first, it was just a legacy piece, a kind of monument to our grandfather's obsession with safekeeping valuables, but over time, that vault became something darker, an inheritance battlefield, a place where grudges fermented like spoiled wine. My brother William and I were close once. He was 2 years older, sharper with numbers, while I was more of the hands-on type, running crews and managing projects. For decades, we worked side by side, building the family name bigger than our father ever imagined. But when William passed suddenly in 2018, everything shifted. His children, my own nephews, looked at me, not like an uncle who had raised them on fishing trips and Saturday barbecues, but like an obstacle standing in the way of what they believed was theirs. The legal mess after William's death was brutal. Our father's estate hadn't been cleanly divided, and though I had poured my life into keeping the company alive, the nephews argued that everything, every house, every dollar, every damn tool belonged to their side of the bloodline. They hired lawyers, leaned on the younger cousins to back them, and suddenly family dinners turned into depositions. But I never thought they'd go so far as to try to erase me entirely. The day it happened, I had been invited to the old bank. They said we needed to go over documents in the vault, and like a fool. I agreed. I told myself it was a step toward reconciliation, maybe even a peace treaty. I remember walking through the iron gate, the Charleston heat pressing against my back, thinking about how many times I had carried those kids on my shoulders down at Folly Beach. When the door sealed and the darkness closed in, I finally realized the truth. They didn't want reconciliation. They wanted me gone, locked away in a tomb of our own making. At first I shouted. I slammed my fists on the metal door until they bled. Their footsteps echoed up the stairs, fading into the street, leaving me in silence. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. The vault smelled of old paper rust and mold. My throat went dry quick, and I sat in the broken chair staring at the flickering light like it might hold an answer. But that was the night I stopped being a victim. That was the night my resolve was born. I remembered the countless times William used to warn me. In this family, Rick, money makes monsters. He had said it with a grin. Back when we still trusted each other, but now his words came back like a curse. My nephews had power, money, lawyers, and the arrogance of youth on their side. I had nothing but my wits, my experience, and time, and I had plenty of that. What they didn't realize was that the vault wasn't just theirs. It had once been mine, too. I had spent years down there when we first bought the building, cataloging files and reorganizing our holdings. I knew its quirks, its hidden weaknesses. They thought they were burying me alive. What they had really done was give me the quiet, the fury, and the fire I needed to build my revenge. I don't know how long I sat there that first night, tracing the cracks in the concrete with my eyes listening to the faint hum of the old wiring in the walls. But by morning I had a plan forming in my mind. My betrayal was complete. My humiliation burned. Now I would bide my time, sharpen my blade in silence, and when I stepped out of that vault, I wouldn't just walk away. I'd make sure every last one of them paid, because nobody locks me away and walks free. The vault wasn't completely airtight. A sliver of air seeped in from a vent, high on the wall, probably installed when the bank first operated. That meant survival was possible, but also that sound carried faintly through. And in those hushed echoes, I began to learn just how deep my nephew's betrayal ran. The vent tasted of mildew and old cigarette smoke, but it was the only thing that kept me alive those first days. The tiny whisper of the world outside, the smell of rain, when a storm rolled over the harbor, the distant rumble of a delivery truck double-parked on King Street. I learned to count the hours by the footsteps that passed the vault's front door, the cadence of voices that drifted down the stairwell, muffled laughter that I once would have joined the sharp-clipped syllables of attorneys, William's name said like an accusation. I pressed my ear to the cold metal and listened until I memorized every sound my family made. At first, I tried to shock them back into conscience. I scratched messages on the inside of the chair with a shard of rusted metal. Rick, do not forget. I hoped someone would see it when they came back down for a final show of ownership. No one did. They treated the vault like an altar and me, like the offering. They had their meetings in the upstairs offices of the old bank, my nephews their lawyers from Charleston and Columbia, and a couple of slick investment advisors flown in from Atlanta. I could hear the cadence of their meetings, terms, leverage exit strategy. They said liquidate, restructure, consolidate. It was all business, speak for burying me under paperwork. Then I started hearing their names in the same sentences as forgery and undisclosed transfers. Not that I understood the fine points of corporate maneuvering. I'd been a builder, not an accountant, but I knew greed when it spoke its name. My nephews were brazen. They whispered about shifting assets into shell companies, about moving deeds, slipping the family's old rental properties into LLCs nobody could touch. They were mapping out how to make the estate vanish from anyone who might challenge them. I realized this was no mere squabble over a will. This was a comprehensive erasure plan. The more I listened, the more clues I gathered. There was a knock at the back door one afternoon, a postal carrier, I think, and through the vents I heard the rustle of envelopes stamped with Payne Harrell attorneys at law. They talked over spreadsheets that crinkled like winter leaves. On the third day, I heard one of my nephews laugh a greedy little sound and call someone the fixer. The word stuck in my head. Fixer. Someone who made problems disappear. Someone who put out fires. The fixer wasn't just a lawyer. He was the kind of man who could move a title slip without anyone seeing the ink dry. I began to feel the shape of their plan, like a map tattooed on the inside of my eyelids. They had bought themselves time, a corporate stranglehold that would make any legal counterattack costly, slow, and humiliating. They assumed that my age would be an ally to them, a tired old man without the strength to fight through the labyrinth of courts and paperwork. They hadn't factored in two things, the stubbornness in my bones and the fact that the vault gave me access to secrets they took for granted. Before William died, he kept a ledger tucked beneath a false panel in the main safe, a habit born from old distrust, he used to joke. The ledger contained ledgers, old receipts, a ledger of property transfers, notes on payments, and a record of people who were owed money or who had been paid off. I'd seen the ledger many times, the way he'd fingered its pages like an old hymn. While they were upstairs believing they'd locked me out of the world, I reached under the torn upholstery, and by the dimming flicker of the single bulb, I pried loose the panel William had clad in years before. My fingers were sticky with rust, and the metal cut the skin. But I found the ledger where he kept it bound in cracked leather, the edges yellowed. That ledger changed everything. There were names in there I hadn't expected, local contractors paid in cash, a named account at a small bank on Broad Street, a series of wire transfers to a name I'd never heard. One entry dated 2016 referenced a consulting fee paid to an E. Marshall with a Charleston P.O. box. Another dated 2012 read, hold for Wyatt, transfer upon condition of death. The handwriting was William's, neat, efficient, with the occasional scrawl that suggested he was hiding something even from himself. I read until dawn. My chest ached. The ledger painted a picture that matched the fragments I'd been hearing. Bribes, hidden payments, a trail of favors that bought silence and protection. William had been keeping the receipts of sins, and my nephews had assumed those sins were buried with him. They weren't. They were in my hands. When I finally let myself believe I could do something, the vault was no longer a prison. It was an archive, a raw material for the war I was about to wage. But there was a problem. I couldn't just storm out, waving a ledger, and expect justice. They had lawyers who could quash anything. I said as hearsay. They had cash clout and contempt for an old man's accusations. I needed evidence that could not easily be dismissed. Documents, bank statements, the receipts for transfers. I needed the paper trail connecting names in that ledger to accounts and addresses that existed in the world beyond the vault escape. Then that was the first step. Not a heroic Hollywood bolt for the door, but a careful plan. I could not break the door from the inside. The hinges were bolted, and the lock mechanism was sophisticated, a throwback to when the bank still kept real money in boxes. But the maintenance hatch behind the stack of plywood shelving was less secure, intended for workers to crawl through during renovations. I knew the old building's blueprints well enough from my years overseeing repairs. I had opened up walls to run wiring, patched foundations to stop leaks. There was one crawl space that led out to an alley behind the building, a narrow chimney-like passage used once to haul out damaged safes. It was tight, dark, and it meant squeezing through dust and old insulation, but it would put me out behind the bank at dusk, where fewer eyes watched and the smell of the Cooper River mingled with takeout grease. I planned it in the quiet of the vault, using a nail I'd sharpened into a kind of compass. In the wood of the chair, I counted steps and measured time, by the noon shadow that crept across the room. When the sun hit the single high window, I waited for a storm. Storms kept people at home and made the streets empty. Charleston has lots of storms. They're part of our weather the way salt is part of our air. A thunderstorm came in on the fourth night, and it was the kind of rain that clean sweeps a city. I used it. The crawl space was tighter than I remembered, filled with the bodies of years, insulation, old wiring, a dislodged brick. I scraped my knuckles raw, getting through. But once I felt the cold air of the alley on my face, I knew I'd taken the most dangerous step. The back of the bank opened into a narrow service lane that ran behind a line of restaurants, Husk's delivery entrance, a pizza joint that smelled like garlic, and Heaven, an old pawn shop that still took guitars from kids who thought music could buy them a future. I moved like a ghost between steel dumpsters, my face pulled low beneath a thrift store cap. I could have walked out the front and demanded my ledger, but that would be a show. They had cameras, and I had no one to corroborate my story. Instead, I slipped into a payphone booth on King Street and called the one person I trusted, Maria Gutierrez. Maria had been my foreman's daughter back when I ran crews in the 1990s. She was scrappy, unafraid, and smarter than most people gave her credit for. She ran a small title company now, hawking honest closings to families who wanted the truth more than they wanted smoke and mirrors. When I told her what had happened, she didn't pity me. She listened, and then she said 3 words, "Bring me proof." The ledger was proof, and it was enough to get her attention. She believed me because she'd been at my side when men tried to cheat workers out of paychecks, when companies filed liens to squeeze small contractors. She had a backyard of tenacity and the keys to a scanner. We met at a booth in a diner on the edge of Mount Pleasant, a place I hadn't been in years. One of those all-night joints where the coffee tastes like slightly bitter salvation. I slid the ledger across the table, and Maria's eyes scanned until smoke lined their edges. She didn't say much. She only reached for her phone and set the recorder on. "You don't know what this will stir?" she said. Her voice was calm, but I could see the gears in her head turning. If those names tie to accounts, it's not just an old ledger, it's a crumb trail. We began with old public records, property deeds, tax filings, corporate registration documents. These are the bones criminals don't think to hide because they assume complexity will bury them. But you can dig out bones if you know where the cemetery is. Maria had a knack for digging. She also had a contact at a small bank that handled a lot of the city's lesser-known trusts. That contact owed her one favor for closing on a little duplex years ago. He'd promised to look into a name, Marshall, and see if there was an account. It was the account that began to make my nephews start to look uneasy. The ledger's consulting transfers linked to a shell account with transactions into companies that owned real property on the peninsula. It was clever money funneled through a set of seemingly legitimate businesses into trusts that no one questioned because they were filed under innocuous names. But there was one thread, a transfer to Wyatt Construction that tied to a contractor who'd built certain additions to the family property in 2014. The more we pulled, the more knots showed up unusual payments around certain election years. Retainer fees paid to an obscure PR firm the Nephews had used to polish their image invoices, paid in cash, with receipts that had terrible handwriting and worse accounting. As the picture sharpened, my anger burned into focus. They had used the family's name as a mask, while they siphoned off fortunes William had known he had left the ledger. As a map to the rot, either out of penitent guilt or because he hoped someone would find it who cared more about truth than profit. Either way, the ledger had put me on the trail. It had given me purpose, and for the first time since they'd shut me away in metal, I felt the breath of the fight on my neck. But we were small, and they were large. They had lawyers that could make subpoenas scream like wolves. They had friends on the city council and a sympathetic judge who'd once been on their holiday card list. I knew I could not simply blare these findings into public without being crushed. We needed to be surgical. Evidence had to be airtight. We needed bank statements, time-stamped emails, signatures that matched ink to paper. We needed a way to bring the ledger into court without it being labeled unverifiable hearsay. Maria, practical as ever, smiled that thin smile that meant she had a plan. "Well, build this like a house," she said, foundation first. She tapped the ledger, then the walls, then we burned their roof down. I felt fear and exhilaration braid together in my chest. We had begun to excavate the family's secrets, but I also knew how dangerous the work could get. The family vault had taught me two things in Iron and Shadow. First, that people you love can become monsters when money feeds them. Second, that monsters, when cornered, do not go quietly. When we left the diner, the sky over Charleston had a bruised look, low clouds threatening rain again. I walked back to my car, holding the ledger like an artifact, a relic of sins, and I realized the fight I had signed up for would not just be about getting what was mine. It would be about exposing a rot that might make powerful men lose far more than money, and men like that with their reputations sewn into the fabric of a town would not stop at legal maneuvers. They would try to break me. That night, as I lay awake on a cheap motel bed near the Ravenel Bridge, I thought of the vault's cold metal and the sound of their laughter. I thought of William's neat handwriting and the smell of old ledger paper. I thought of Mariah's steady eyes somewhere in the house my nephews had bought with quick money. A glass of scotch had been poured as they counted their wins. They assumed the old man in the motel room would be easy to dismiss. They hadn't met the old me yet. They hadn't measured how hunger tightens in a chest that refuses to bow. I closed my eyes and let the ledger rest on my chest like a promise. In the morning I would begin building the proof we needed, and when the first stone was laid, there would be no going back. Outside, thunder rolled like distant drums, and somewhere far away, a church bell struck 3 times. I slept like someone who has a map and knows where the treasure is buried, and also knows a trap lies along the trail. The ledger was the map, Maria was my compass, and the family that locked me away would soon find that an old man with nothing to lose can be very dangerous. When I opened my eyes at dawn, my phone had 3 missed calls and a name I didn't expect: Wyatt. The name Wyatt on my screen sent a cold current straight through me. Wyatt Construction was written more than once in William's ledger. To anyone else, it looked like a vendor, just another contractor. But I remembered Wyatt Sanders, the son of a roughneck carpenter who had hired decades ago, a kid who had once shadowed me on sites watching how I ran crews. Wyatt grew up smart, fast-talking, and slippery. When he started his own company in Columbia, we threw him a few contracts out of loyalty, but loyalty was cheap to him. By the mid-2000s, he was padding invoices, double-billing materials, and I had to cut him loose. Now, years later, his name glowed on my phone like a warning flare. Why would Wyatt be calling me at dawn, days after my so-called family had locked me in a vault? My gut said he knew more than he should. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I let it ring out, then played his voicemail. "Rick, it's Wyatt. Listen, Don, hang up. If you hear this, we need to talk. Your nephews. Those boys are in deep, deeper than you think. And if I'm being honest, I'm in deeper too. But I can't carry their weight anymore. Call me back." Soon, his voice was raw, desperate, not the smug tone of a man who still had control. I sat there in that motel room, the curtains half drawn against the weak Charleston sunrise, and weighed it. Wyatt was a crook, no doubt, but crooks sometimes make the best informants. If he had a crack in him, I could wedge it wide open. Maria wasn't convinced when I told her. She met me later that morning at her office off Coleman Boulevard, her desk stacked with closing folders and half-drunk coffee. "You can't trust Wyatt. He'll sell you out for $50 and a hot lunch." Maybe I said, flipping open William's ledger. "But look here. Payments to Wyatt. Construction in 2014, 2016, and again in 2017. These weren't small jobs, and yet there's no record of the properties being improved. That means he was part of the wash." Maria tapped her pen against the table, chewing on the inside of her cheek. "If he flips, it's dangerous. For him and for us. The nephews won't forgive that kind of betrayal," Good, I muttered. "Let them feel what betrayal tastes like." That night, I called Wyatt back. He answered on the first ring, his words rushing out like water through a broken pipe. "Rick, Jesus, thank God you called. I've been looking over my shoulder for days. They came to me with jobs, easy jobs. They said, just bill under your company name, run the invoices through, I'd get a cut, they'd get their clean money. I didn't know how big it was until the numbers stacked too high to ignore." "You knew," I said coldly. "You always know when you're being dirty." Silence then, a sigh. "Yeah, but your nephews, they're not playing with just family money. They're moving political donations, PAC money, laundering it through real estate. They're into federal territory, Rick, and they're sloppy. If I go down, I'm pulling them with me. That's why I'm calling you. You want revenge. I want protection." The words hung in the air. Protection I asked to meet in public neutral ground. We chose the Waffle House, off Savannah Highway, a place busy enough that nobody would dare try anything violent, but quiet enough to talk. Wyatt showed up jittery, his hands shaking as he stirred sugar into his coffee. His once immaculate suits were gone. He wore a wrinkled polo, his hair thin and wild. He slid a flash drive across the table wrapped in a napkin. Invoices, emails, bank statements. I kept them as leverage. If they ever turned on me, I'd have something to trade. Now I won out. I picked up the drive, turning it in my hand. It was small, cheap, the kind you'd find in a convenience store rack, but the weight of it felt enormous. This wasn't just suspicion or a dead man's ledger. This was tangible, digital proof. Wyatt leaned forward, his eyes darting around the restaurant. "You don't understand, Rick. They're untouchable in this city. Councilmen, judges, even the bank presidents. Everyone owes them something. You walk this into a courthouse, and you'll get laughed out. Or worse, then I won't walk it into a courthouse." I said not yet, because I had begun to see the shape of the war court. Wasn't the first battlefield. Reputation was. If I could pull back the mask, show the city who my nephews really were, they'd lose their shield of respectability, and only then, when the city turned its back, would the law have teeth. Over the next week, Maria and I combed through Wyatt's drive, What we found was uglier than either of us imagined: falsified invoices for non-existent renovations, consulting fees routed to shell companies, donations to political campaigns disguised as construction reimbursements. There were even photographs of properties that had never been touched, time-stamped to prove work hadn't been done. It was an empire of lies held together by arrogance and the assumption that no one would look too closely. But I was looking now, and I wasn't looking away. Maria printed copies, storing them in a locked cabinet in her office. I carried a set in a waterproof envelope tucked into my jacket. Every step felt dangerous, like we were walking through a minefield with a lantern. But I also felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. My humiliation in that vault had transformed into resolve. The nephews, though, were not oblivious. I could feel the shift in their posture when I saw them at a downtown cafe one morning. They looked at me like a ghost. One of them, the eldest, Aaron, smirked, his voice dripping with mockery as he walked past my table. "Uncle Rick didn't think we'd see you walking around. Guess the old vault wasn't tight enough, huh?" His friends chuckled. My hands clenched on the coffee cup so hard the ceramic nearly cracked. But I forced a smile. "Funny thing about vaults," I said softly. "Sometimes they keep things in. Sometimes they keep secrets out." For the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. I left that cafe knowing the war was no longer secret. They knew I was alive, free, and watching, and that meant the next move would be theirs. That night, as rain hammered against the motel windows, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the ledger on one side of me and the flash drive on the other. My nephews thought they had locked me in a tomb, but what they had really done was hand me the keys to their own, and I was ready to start turning them. The first counterattack came quicker than I expected. It was a Thursday morning, heavy with Charleston humidity, when I stepped out of the motel and found the tires on my car slashed. Not once, not twice, but all four sliced open, like someone had taken a blade to them in deliberate silence. On the windshield sat a note handwritten in bold black marker: "Stay buried." I stood there on the steaming asphalt, the smell of rubber in the air, my jaw locked tight. They wanted me rattled. They wanted me to think I was still trapped in that vault, even out in the open. But all they did was prove they were scared. Maria wasn't surprised. She leaned back in her office chair, sipping her coffee with that calm fire in her eyes. "They know you've got something." "Good." Fear makes people sloppy, but slashed tires were just a warning. What came next was worse. 2 days later, Wyatt called in a panic. His voice trembled through the phone. "Rick, they know I talked to you. I don't know how, but they do. There was a black SUV parked outside my house last night, just sitting there with the lights off. My wife's scared out of her mind. I can't do this. Listen to me," I said firmly. "You stay calm. You keep your head down. Maria and I will handle the rest." But even as I said it, I knew we were past the point of safety. My nephews weren't content with intimidation anymore. They were preparing for war. That night, Maria spread out our evidence across her dining room table: the ledger, Wyatt's Drive bank statements, property transfers, all of it laid out like a battlefield map. "If they're already moving against us," she said, "we need to hit first, hard." How I asked. "They own the judges, the council, the banks, not the press." She said. I frowned. "The press can be bought too. Not if we hand them something so airtight it can't be ignored. Not if we give them documents that scream corruption in black and white." Her plan was simple and devastating: leak the cleanest, most incriminating pieces to a reporter at the Post and Courier. Not everything, just enough to get the scent in the air. A few doctored invoices, a property deed transfer that contradicted public records, and the political donation routed through a shell LLC. Enough to make headlines, enough to make people ask questions. We moved carefully. Maria contacted an old college friend, a journalist named Laura Hernandez, who had a reputation for digging into Charleston's power elite. When Laura agreed to meet, we knew we had our opening. The meeting took place at a small seafood shack off Shem Creek. the kind of place with picnic tables and paper plates where no one looked twice at a group of people talking in hushed tones. Laura had sharp eyes that missed nothing. She listened as Maria laid out the documents, her expression shifting from skepticism to a hard, focused hunger. "If this is real," she said quietly, "it's not just a family squabble. It's money laundering, political corruption, and tax fraud rolled together. I can run with it, but once I do, you'd better be ready. This town protects its darlings until the very last second. Then it tears them apart like piranhas." I leaned forward, my voice steady. "We're ready." Within a week, the first article hit the front page. Charleston heirs tied to suspicious property deals. The story didn't name me, but it didn't have to. The focus was on the Nephews, their LLCs, their political donations, their unexplained wealth. The documents Maria provided were published in full black ink against newsprint. Undeniable Charleston buzzed on King Street. I overheard strangers murmuring about the greedy Sanders boys at the courthouse. Whispers followed them like shadows. The mask of respectability was cracking, but victory was never that simple. The very next night I came back to the motel and found my door ajar. Inside, the room had been ransacked. Drawers yanked open the mattress, slashed the TV, knocked off its stand. They hadn't stolen anything, at least not what they wanted. The envelope of copies I kept hidden under the mattress was gone. I sank into the broken chair, rage coursing through me. They thought they'd stolen the only set. They thought they had clipped my wings, but Maria had been smarter than all of us. Every document was scanned and backed up 3 times, on a hard drive in her office in encrypted cloud storage, and in a safety deposit box under her daughter's name. "They'll never learn." Maria said, when I told her we've got redundancies they can't touch. All they're doing is digging their hole deeper. She was right, but the message was clear. This was no longer about intimidation or silence. It was survival, for them and for me. The Nephews started showing up in public less often, their smug grins replaced with nervous darting eyes, but their arrogance wasn't gone. Aaron confronted me in the parking lot of a grocery store one afternoon, his jaw tight, his voice low enough that no one else could hear. "You think you've won, old man. You don't know the half of what you've started. Keep pushing and you won't just lose your money. You'll lose everything." I stared him down, my voice like steel. "You already took everything from me when you locked me in that vault. Now I'm just taking it back." He didn't reply. He just sneered, but the twitch in his jaw betrayed him. The fear was there, and that's when I knew they were slipping. Their power wasn't infinite. They bled like anyone else. The vault had been their attempt to bury me, but it had become my crucible, and I was ready to finish what they started because the next strike would be mine. The city smelled different after the article, less like old magnolias and more like a rumor that wouldn't wash off people. I'd known for decades averted their eyes on King Street, and men had once shared a beer with crossed to the other side of the sidewalk. My nephews hired more security, their cars driving like small armored convoys through the historic district. They paid for private investigations and quietly bought favors. They swaggered in public, but their hands betrayed them, checking phones, scanning license plates, watching shadows. Every step they took made a sound that told me they were afraid. That fear was an advantage I intended to use until it became a weapon. Maria and I didn't rush revenge that's theatrical, gets talked about, and then dismissed revenge that's surgical, lasts. We built a timeline, a blueprint for collapse. We prioritized public exposure first, legal leverage second, and personal humiliation third, because humiliation would crack the mask of pedigree they used to hide behind. We had documents, digital trails, photographs, and now Wyatt, who for all his failings could name men who'd received checks and shook hands with my nephews at private dinners. But we needed one more thing, a moment, a public moment that would force those with influence to choose between them and the truth. That moment came in the shape of a gala, Charleston's annual heritage ball at the Gibbs Museum, a night when the city's elite dressed up and pretended nothing ugly existed beneath the polished silver and crystal chandeliers. The Sanders boys were co-hosting a reception for a new downtown development, and the guest list was a who's who of donors, judges, and council members. If we could leak a targeted dossier to someone reputable on the inside of that night, if the right journalist could be there with the right questions, their empire's veneer would crack in front of people who once would have written them checks without looking. Laura from the Post and Courier moved quickly. She loved a good takedown the way a chess player loves the moment a decisive piece is captured. She told us she could get a photographer and a reporter into the Heritage Ball under a pretext, and that was all we needed. Maria and I prepared the dossier, copies of the ledger entries tied to bank transfers, invoices with matching GPS metadata, proving work hadn't been done, emails from a PR firm coordinating donations timed around campaign relief funds. We printed them on thick paper, organized them into bundles with color-coded tabs, and wrote short summaries that were impossible to dismiss at a cocktail party. We knew the effect we wanted: a polite question in front of the right people, a polite paper left on a lapel, a photographer's flash that caught a lie in the eyes of a man used to being adored. On the night of the ball, I wore a suit I hadn't used since William's funeral. It smelled faintly of mothballs and regret, but it fit like armor, and that's what I needed. My nephews moved through the crowd with practiced ease, shaking hands, kissing cheeks, collecting promises. I took a corner booth, the dossier hidden inside a portfolio beneath the table. Maria was beside me, calmer than I felt, scanning faces like a hunter. Searching for the faintest scent, Laura arrived with two others. Her photographer, a wiry woman named Tess, and a junior reporter who looked terrified and excited all at once. Laura's plan was simple: confront the oldest nephew, Aaron, with a precise public question, and then cascade outward, letting the ripples appear in front of friends and donors. We would not shout or demand indictments on the spot. Instead, we would let polite society do its work, whispering, withdrawing, and peering over shoulders. When the moment came, Tess positioned herself at the buffet, camera ready. Laura approached Aaron with the kind of soft-step professionalism that disarmed suspicion, a polite smile that hid the blade. "Mr. Sanders," she said, leaning in, as if asking for a recipe, "there are documents linking your LLCs to transfers labeled as political donations. Can you explain why these funds were routed through construction invoices?" The smile froze. Aaron's hand stilled on a crystal flute. Around him, laughter fell into a sudden, awkward silence that felt like the pressure you get when a storm is about to break. He waved a practiced, thin dismissal. "Well, you know how these things get reported, Laura. Accounting is messy, but he couldn't name a man who'd approved the transfers. Someone near Heim, an old bank director, shifted in discomfort. A councilman scanned the room and found that his name was on a list Laura had left earlier at his table in a neat envelope. Tess's camera caught the flinch on Aaron's face, the way his mouth tightened. Polite society began its work. Conversations thinned. A woman I'd seen at church for years left without her coat. A prominent donor excused himself and never returned. The room became a place for people to reconcile their social calendars with their moral ones. The sound of withdrawal was subtle but devastating. That night, back in my motel room, my phone filled with headlines. Aaron's face was on the paper screens all over Charleston. I slept the way people do when something monstrous finally gets light, but sleep was a brief truce. By dawn, the reprisals began. They sued first libel claims, injunctions a demand that the paper reveal sources. Lawyers sent letters threatening to freeze accounts and seize documents. A judge with old-fashioned sympathies granted a temporary gag order on Laura, declaring that stories could not be printed without the production of raw evidence. It was the kind of legal move designed to strangle a story before it breathes. We expected this. Maria had been careful backups existed in places the nephews could not reach. But law can be a suffocating thing. Even when truth is on your side, the machinery of courts written in a language most people don't read can buy terrain and time. We needed something irrefutable, an asset so public that the law would have to contend with the court of public opinion first. Wyatt, in the meantime, was changing his story. At first shaky and compliant, he had become more focused. Fear will do that to a man. It narrows his vision and gives him edges. He provided us more a ledger of payments he had kept to protect himself, screenshots of messages where my nephews discussed methods in crude detail, and most importantly, a recorded conversation between Aaron and a man identified as the Fixer. The Fixer's voice was oily, practiced, and he spoke of moving money through a particular escrow account that, when traced, led to an offshore trust. It was the kind of conversation that, when played in public, makes people listen. We decided to use it not in court, but on air. A local public radio station, small, earnest, and with a reputation for investigative pieces, agreed to air an excerpt. The moment the Fixer's voice played amid the sober commentary, the room where it broadcast cracked open like glass. People called in outrage, stunned, eager to know how close corruption had come to home. The station stream was shared 1,000 times. The Nephews' allies began to flinch again. That was the point when things got personal. Aaron's house was vandalized, spray paint on the driveway calling him a thief. Tires slashed in a return echo of my earlier warning. Someone left a dead fish at their front door with a note. Smell of the harbor settles on liars. It was a crude message, ugly and animal, and the family yelled police and played victim. But their screams had an odd ring, defensive, not innocent. The kind of noise someone makes when they're trying to direct attention away from the thing they'd prefer not to have examined. Then their lawyers started pushing for arbitration, private panels, closed rooms, settlements with non-disclosure agreements that would have ended the public ripples we were making. If they could buy silence, the ledger in the drive would snap closed again like a coffin. Maria and I anticipated the arbitration tactic. We also anticipated that some men will dawdle for control in the shadows and only feel comfortable when deals are hidden. We needed to make arbitration impossible without them admitting guilt in public. So we set our most audacious trap. We arranged for a public forum on ethics in local governance, an academic-sounding panel at the College of Charleston that would be attended by professors, lawyers, and local activists. We made sure Laura's editor sat on the panel as a moderator. We leaked the topic as Transparency in Real Estate in Southern Cities Bait, with a title that sounded benign and civic-minded. The Sanders boys, eager to rehabilitate their image, agreed to appear as sponsors and panelists. They would be there in front of cameras, in front of community leaders, to talk about responsible development. What they did not know was that we had placed a mole in their circle, someone they trusted to help stage manage their appearance. Wyatt, terrified but resolved, offered to be that someone. He promised to hand over a set of original signed invoices. He'd kept documents that had physical ink, not just pixels that bore the unmistakable signatures of their finance director. He said he would place these documents in the file handed to the moderator just before the panel began. The plan required precision and nerve. It required the sort of audacity that makes you wonder whether you are heroic or crazy. We counted on one thing more than any other: pride. Men used to controlling a town's tone will agree to public forums to show they are magnanimous. They'd walk themselves into a stage in front of cameras to prove they were above petty squabbles. Pride, we discovered, is a sly trapdoor. On the day of the forum, the sky was clear, a rare, bright Carolina blue that made everyone look well-traveled and safe. The auditorium filled with people who wanted to believe their city honest. The Sanders boys sat on stage with 50 faces of community behind them, their smiles trained like polished knives. I sat in the audience with Maria and Laura, the portfolio feeling heavy in my hands, Wyatt's hands sweating in my pocket like a live thing. When the moderator announced that a community member had provided documents for context to the discussion, Tessa's camera focused on Aaron's, face a PA handed the file to the moderator. She opened it, glanced down, and her face changed in the tiniest degree, the flicker of comprehension that betrays a lie. Laura stood up from the audience microphone, poised as if to ask the first polite question, and then, with the authority that only a seasoned reporter has said, There are original invoices in this packet that seem to match other documents we've been reviewing." She turned to Aaron and asked simply, "Can you explain these silence spread like oil?" Aaron's mouth moved, searching for the practiced dismissal, but his hands betrayed him a tremor, a paper fold gone crooked. A woman in the second row whispered the name of a council member printed on a receipt, and he shook his head. Gallows laughter. The panel dissolved into chaos, and the controlled discourse replaced by urgent questions and the small, ugly sound of reputations cracking. The moderator called for a recess. Someone demanded the documents be photographed. Tess's camera clicked like a metronome, holding the moment like a portrait. I felt a hot private satisfaction, then the kind that tastes like iron and victory. But I also felt the cold finger of danger. The stadium doors were shut, and men who had long protected one another looked like wounded animals. They would not go down quietly. As the auditorium emptied into a hallway humming with angry whispers, I felt a man's hand close on my shoulder. It was Aaron, but not the Aaron I had seen on the stage. This Aaron's face was pale, and his eyes had the kind of uncertain heat only people who've been startled awake possess. He leaned in close, his voice low and sharp. "You want this to end," he hissed. "You want to ruin us. Fine, but answer me this. What are you willing to lose to make sure we don't come back at you?" I met his eyes, remembering the cold metal and the vault, the ledger under my arm like a promise. The auditorium's buzz faded into something vast and slow. I had lost something already years. Family trust, but revenge is not about balance sheets, it's about truth and consequence. I smiled, and it was the calm of a man who had nothing left to fear. "Everything I said, everything you're willing to take." In that silent corner with velvet curtains and civic lights behind us, his breath came out in a tight laugh. "Then it's not just your money, take," he said. "It's everything that makes you comfortable, your home, your friends, your dignity. A warning, not a threat, and worse for its civility." I watched him walk away and felt the wind of the next storm pass through the hall. We had won a public moment, but their rage had become something different, personal, surgical, and patient. As Maria and I left the college into the humid evening, I realized then that the war had changed its shape. No longer was it merely a battle for evidence or reputation. Now it had teeth. Outside under the low Spanish moss, a car idled in the parking lot a little too long, its windows dark. As we approached its engine cut, a figure stepped out. Not in a suit, but in a plain gray hoodie, hands in pockets, face obscured. He stood perfectly still as we passed, and for a second his shadow merged with the shadow of the oak trees. I felt with the clarity of old wounds that the next move had already been set into motion. I should have seen the signs. I should have known the ratchets of their revenge would wind tighter. But the ledger had taught me one more thing. Men who steal from the past will always be stolen from in return. The trick was making sure the theft came in the light where everyone could see the exchange. We walked on, and behind us the figure lingered as patient as a tide. The war had turned private, and that I knew was when it would hurt the most. The figure in the hoodie haunted me long after that night. For weeks it seemed like every step I took in Charleston carried an echo. A grocery store aisle where a man lingered a second too long, a black sedan idling near the Ravenel Bridge at midnight, a shadow that fell across my motel blind steady as a heartbeat. The Nephews weren't striking with lawyers now. They were moving in silence, trying to wear me down, to remind me of the vault, that cage of air and shadows where I was supposed to die forgotten. But fear, when you've already tasted the worst of it, becomes something else. It becomes fuel. Maria pressed me to be careful, but she also pressed forward harder than ever. "They're circling," she told me one night, "over a table of files. That means we've got them. Wolves don't circle unless they're bleeding." She was right. The article, the gala, the invoices, they had opened wounds in my nephew's empire. Donations were drying up. A state-level ethics board had begun sniffing around, and then came the subpoena. It landed on Aaron's doorstep first, then his brother Mark's, a demand for financial records issued by a federal investigator whose name even Maria hadn't expected. The feds weren't just curious, they were hunting, and the ledger combined with Wyatt's recordings had been enough to start the machine rolling, but the Sanders boys still had claws. The next strike was personal. I came back to the motel one afternoon and found the door ajar again. My gut dropped cold as iron. Inside, nothing was stolen, nothing was broken. Instead, on the bed laid out with surgical precision was a framed photo of my wife. She'd been gone 15 years. Cancer took her in 2008. The photo was one I kept in storage, a wedding picture from the Battery. Her veil dancing in the harbor breeze. I hadn't brought it with me, which meant someone had gone into my house, dug through my private things, and planted it there as a message. On the back of the frame, written in red marker, were 2 words, "Remember her?" I sat down on the bed, shaking. For the first time since the vault, I felt the edge of real panic. They weren't threatening money or comfort anymore. They were digging at ghosts, at grief, at the things that could still break me. But the panic hardened into something sharper. I whispered to the empty room, "You think you can own my past? Watch me burn your future." The next morning, Maria and I met Laura in the back booth of a diner in North Charleston. The coffee was weak, the eggs rubbery, but the determination on that table was stronger than any weapon the Nephews had. "We push everything," Laura said, "all of it, the recordings, the ledgers, the invoices, the photographs. We feed it into the federal investigation, and we flood the press at the same time. They can't fight 2 wars at once. It was dangerous if we pushed too early. We risked being accused of obstruction. But if we waited, the Nephews would keep tightening their noose around me." I thought of the photo of my wife, and I nodded. We push. The release hit like a storm surge. The Post and Courier ran a Sunday expose with 3 full pages of evidence. The radio station played the fixer's voice in full, the entire tape, no edits. A national outlet picked up the story, framing it as "The Charleston Dynasty Crumbling Under Corruption Probe." The words "family vault" even made it into the headlines, a metaphor too perfect for the reporters to resist. Overnight, the Sanders name turned from legacy to liability. Their businesses hemorrhaged clients. A major bank froze 2 accounts pending investigation. A councilman returned a campaign donation live on camera, and then came the arrests. Federal agents raided one of their downtown offices on a rainy Tuesday morning. The sight of men in suits carrying out boxes of files and hard drives hit Charleston like a lightning bolt. For the first time, the boys weren't untouchable. They were defendants. But the victory came with a price. Wyatt, who had been our key, disappeared. His house stood empty. His truck abandoned in a parking lot by the river. No note, no message. Maria feared the worst, but I suspected he had simply run too scared to stand in the fire he helped light. And me, I couldn't go home. Not yet. The photo of my wife proved the Nephews, or their allies, still had reach. Even with federal eyes on them, prideful men do reckless things when cornered. The night after the raids, I stood outside the old bank building, the family vault inside it, silent and dark. The iron gate creaked in the breeze. I pressed my hand against the stone and whispered, "You tried to bury me here. Instead, I buried you." For the first time in months, I felt the weight ease off my chest. But I also knew the story wasn't finished. Courtrooms are slow. Legacies take years to unravel, and men like my Nephews don't vanish quietly. I turned and walked away, the ledger under my arm like a sword I'd finally learned to wield. And in that walk, I realized the truth that would haunt me forever. Sometimes revenge doesn't end with a bang. Sometimes it ends with silence, the kind that makes a man wonder if his enemies are gone or just waiting for the next strike. The courthouse smelled of floor polish and old justice, the kind of antiseptic that pretends to be impartial and never quite. As I walked into the federal building on a damp morning in downtown Charleston, feeling like a man who had been remade in slow hot fire, Reporters clustered beneath the columns, their breath fogging in the cold that doesn't belong to our city, but seems to live in courtrooms. Cameras clicked like the claws of 1,000 small birds. My nephews arrived in suits that wanted to be armor. The seams showed that they hadn't paid enough for protection. They moved like men who'd been taught how to look untouched, but their eyes told a different story, small, sharp islands of panic. The trial that followed was long enough to hollow you out if you let it. Weeks became a litany of receipts and ledgers and voices called to the stand. Laura's articles had done their work. The public's appetite for the story turned each witness into an oracle. Federal prosecutors were clinical, precise, and patient. They stitched together an argument that began with Williams' ledger and ran a thread to shell companies, to the fixers, escrow accounts, to the PR invoices and the political donations that had been laundered through construction contracts. It was a tapestry of greed, and on the day they began playing the fixers' recorded voice in the courtroom, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. Wyatt's testimony surprised me. He'd gone missing, yes, vanished like a ghost, and for days we feared the worst. Then one morning a thin envelope appeared in Mariah's office, a single note and a phone number. Wyatt was alive, sitting under witness protection in a motel as shabby as mine had been, but safer, and he'd agreed to come clean. His voice in the courtroom crackled like raw wire raw, with shame, shock, and a kind of bitter relief. He walked through invoices he'd manufactured, hands trembling, as he pointed to dates and signatures and the sums that had padded the family coffers. The defense tried to paint him as a liar, a disgruntled contractor with a grudge, but the paper trail was a road too long to deny. When Wyatt looked at me across the courtroom, there was apology there, clumsy, unmoored, and human. "Why did you do it?" the prosecutor asked him. Wyatt's answer was a rasp of regret. Because they were the family that taught me how to ask for favors and make them legal. Because they made it seem small at first. Because somebody always covered for them. Am not proud. I needed to stop before it took everything. His fingers curled into the wood of the witness box as if he needed that hold. That moment, more than any headline or raid, felt like a hinge. Swinging. When a man who'd once been complicit stood under oath and named names, the scaffolding of their protection began to creak. Witnesses feared would clam up bank, clerks, low-level accountants, found their courage when they saw the pattern, the concrete evidence, the names repeated like a litany. A county assessor who had once taken vacations funded by discreet envelopes testified that he had felt uncomfortable and had been paid to look the other way. A PR executive produced drafts of messaging about philanthropic initiatives that were in fact shutters for funneling money, a small, ugly truth stacked into an unanswerable pile. The defense was not without craft. They tried to argue elder manipulation, an old man with a grudge trying to take down his nephews. They whispered about family fights and bitter inheritances. They hired expensive lawyers who sought to shame me on the stand, to suggest that my age had made me vengeful and unreliable. I expected this. I had known their playbook for months. I sat through their attempts like a man who's been weathered by storms. When they tried to drag my past into mud, I held my jaw so hard it ached. You can't be made small again if you refuse to let them hand you that role. The jury deliberated for 3 days. Those felt like months. I walked the courthouse steps at odd hours, counting my breaths, feeling the old ache in my knees. As a drumbeat of time, I thought of the vault of the single bulb of the ledger under my arm when I crawled out into night and rain. I thought of Mariah's hands, and Laura's voice, and Wyatt's shaky apology. I thought of my wife's picture, how someone had put it on my motel bed to make me flinch, and I promised in the silence between heartbeats that I would not let their cruelty be the last thing I remembered about my family. When the verdict came, guilty on multiple counts, the sound in the courtroom was a mix of stunned silence and the low hum of disbelief. My nephews stared at one another like men seeing an end that had once seemed impossible. The judge's face was grave as he read out the sentencing guidelines in terms listeners could not help but hear. As doom, the media called it a fall from grace. Older acquaintances called me to say they were sorry they'd turned away on King Street. I took none of their apologies as charity. I had not wanted their pity. I wanted the truth. Then the civil suits followed. Assets were frozen, properties placed in receivership, fancy cars rolled into holding yards. A major bank that had been their ally exercised clauses and sued for breaches that forced public accounting. The family businesses that had been built on the old money my father had started were parceled out like estate sales. Where they had once walked with smiles and invitations, they now walked with court summonses and collections notices. Men who had once been invited onto boards found their names quietly removed. What felt satisfying about watching them fall was not the spectacle, but the sound of their own networks retracting. Friends who had once said nothing now called to distance themselves. Donors returned checks, and the city's social calendar edited them like a conscience had finally been hired. Their wives faced the damp clinical reality of reputations undone, and while a court cannot force empathy, it can strip away the gloss. That strip felt like justice. Yet the war had not been without cost. I lost privacy in ways I hadn't expected. Reporters tracked down distant cousins to ask for memories. Old friends called with questions that smelled of curiosity more than concern. People I had trusted with mortgages and small favors suddenly found their names in paragraphs of background context. I understood then that revenge isn't a neat equation of cause and effect. It is a messy business. The ledger had been a key, but keys opened doors that sometimes let in bad weather. Wyatt, after testifying, entered the witness protection program. I never saw him again, though Maria told me once that she'd received a postcard with nothing written on it but a single line. The ocean is wide enough. I kept that postcard in a drawer for a long time, and then burned it one winter night when the smell of smoke seemed less bitter than the photographs that had once been used as weapons against me. The day the sentencing came, the courthouse packed again. The nephew who had been the loudest in public, Aaron, received a harsher sentence than the others. The weight of his arrogance finally turned to lead. He sat with his face an even mask as the judge read words that would cost him years. I watched the handcuffs close over his wrists and felt something I hadn't expected. Not jubilation, not relief, but a muted echo, like someone closing a book whose spine you had helped break. Afterward, there were quiet things to repair. Maria and I went to my little house on the Battery. In the months since I'd been forced to live out of a motel, my house had been maintained by a neighbor who liked to keep certain old men in the loop. We cleared the drawers where the nephew's proxies had once rifled through letters. We learned what it meant to have silence that wasn't heavy anymore, but truthful. I took my wife's framed photo off the mantel and placed it at the center of the table, not as an act of mourning, but as a small, stubborn assertion of what I would not let be used against me again. People asked if I felt vindicated. No, I told them, there's a difference between being vindicated and being hollowed out by the truth you had to make others hear. The ledger had opened a door. Yes, but what I had learned was that truth exacts its own price. Men who'd been complicit got ruined, and some of the ruins were the small private ones. Friendships that once felt solid and now lay in tatters. Quiet reputations that could not be stitched back together. A neighborhood that now whispers, "When you pass." Still, the public payoff had been real. Judges had read evidence, men had been sentenced, banks had requested receivers, the Volta place, designed to shut me away, stood as a relic of a family that had been exposed. I drove past it one early morning. The iron gate closed and a notice taped on the door that it was to be secured, pending legal review. Sunlight found the dust on its windows like a benediction. Despite all that, there was a part of me that couldn't wholly relax. Men punished like this sometimes become small and dangerous. They can build resentments that fester. They leave behind allies who trade silence for loyalty elsewhere. The nephews might be behind bars, but their reach had been long, and not all hands that once belonged to them were now empty. Weeks after the sentencing, on a humid evening when the city smelled of fried shrimp and the tide was high, I found a key tucked beneath the wiper of my old pickup. It was a simple thing, an old brass house, key warm from where a hand had held it, with a small strip of masking tape around it. Nothing written on the tape, nothing obvious. I held it between my fingers and felt the old thrill of being hunted and the older thrill of being the hunter. Someone wanted me to know that they could still touch me, or perhaps they wanted me to remember the vault one last time. I did not call the police that night. I sat on my porch under the humming streetlight and listened to the city breathe. The key sat on the table like an unspoken question. If it was a threat, it was a clumsy one. If it was an apology, it was too late. If it was an invitation, then, to what? I put the key in my pocket and walked to the water. The harbor was dark and patient, the Ravenel Bridge a spine of lights cut into the sky. I thought of the men I'd watched fall of the ledgers, brittle pages of the way my nephews had once laughed in the vault as they closed the door. I thought of my wife, of the picture of her on my mantel, and the quiet life I'd been trying to stitch back together. As I stood there, a message pinged on my phone. It was from an unknown number. The text was brief and had the flat economy of threats and truths. You did well, but some things stay locked. The harbor wind lifted my hair. The key in my pocket felt heavier than it should. I understood in that instant that revenge is rarely tidy. It closes some doors and opens others. It can bring justice and then deliver a silence that echoes like a locked chamber. I folded the phone shut and looked back toward the city lights. The vault building sat like a sleeping thing on King Street, its iron gate darker than the rest. For a breathless, stupid moment, I wanted to go back to put on a suit of my worst courage and smash the door with my bare hands just to prove it could be done. Then I thought of the ledger's pages, of all the people it had cost, and I stepped instead into the night. The key, a cold weight near my hip. Behind me, a pair of footsteps paused and then continued, measured and careful. Someone was out there still watching, waiting perhaps, counting the cost of their betrayal, the way I had. The air tasted of salt and the faint metallic hint of rain. I reached into my pocket, felt the brass teeth of the key, and realized that some locks are meant to be opened and some are meant to be kept in the dark. The footsteps stopped. The night held its breath. Charleston never really sleeps, not even when the streets look empty. The harbor wind carries whispers through the alleys, and Spanish moss swings like a pendulum over secrets. After that message, you did well, but some things stay. Locked, he moved differently. Not like a man terrified, but like one who knows the game isn't finished even after the scoreboard says it is. The nephews were gone, sentenced, processed, reduced to numbers in the federal system. Their empire was ash, their allies scrambling like roaches under a sudden light. Yet the text told me something vital. I hadn't cut every thread. There was still a hand somewhere tugging at strings. The brass key burned in my pocket, not with heat, but with implication. It didn't match any of my doors. I checked. I even drove past the old bank again, wondering if it might fit there, but the locks had been changed, taped with official seals. The kind of government tape you don't break unless you want trouble from men who enjoy giving it. One night I sat at my kitchen table, the key between my fingers, the house quiet, except for the hum of the fridge. I turned it over and over, staring at the strip of masking tape wrapped around its bow. Still blank, still mute. But I knew it meant something. Maria warned me not to chase it. You've already won. Rick, don't give them another chance. Whoever's left wants you restless. Don't let them. She was right, but restlessness was already in me. Weeks passed, Charleston's headlines moved on. Another scandal took the city's attention, another fall from grace. My name faded from lips that had once whispered it with both awe and pity. I thought maybe, just maybe, the shadow that had followed me since the vault was thinning. Then one humid evening in July, I found an envelope slipped under my door. No return address. Inside was a single Polaroid, grainy and washed out. The photo showed the family vault door, heavy steel scratched with age, and hanging from the lock was a key identical to the one in my pocket. My stomach tightened. Whoever had sent this knew I still carried the key. They wanted me to connect it. They wanted me to come back. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my armchair with the lights low, the Polaroid on the table, the key beside it. The house creaked, the night deepened, and in the silence I remembered every sound from that vault, the echo of laughter as they locked me in the flicker of the bulb, the hiss of my own breath in the stale air. The message was clear unfinished business. I decided to face it. The next morning before dawn, I drove to King Street. The city was quiet. Shop fronts shuttered the air thick with salt. I parked 2 blocks away and walked the rest. The old bank loomed against the pale sky. Its iron gate locked its windows dark, and there taped to the gate was another envelope. Inside was a note scrawled in a hand I didn't recognize. The vault never kept them out. It kept something in. I stood there for a long time, the paper trembling in my hand, the brass key heavy in my pocket. I didn't try the lock. Not then. Not ever, maybe, because revenge had already taken everything I had to give, and what waited behind that steel door was no longer mine to fight. I turned away from the vault, my footsteps echoing on the empty street. For the first time in months, I felt something colder than rage, heavier than triumph. I felt the weight of truth that some betrayals, some legacies never end. They only wait in silence like the air inside a tomb. As I walked back to my truck, the dawn broke over Charleston warm and golden, as if the city itself wanted to forget. But I never will, because when you've been locked in a vault by your own blood, you don't forget the darkness. You carry it, you breathe it, and you know deep down that no matter how many enemies fall, some doors should never be opened. The end.